They asked for volunteers for a secret mission.
And we were eager, and we knew that there was danger.
The Japanese had already infiltrated Burma.
Once the rain started, well, it was a sea of mud from then on. So I don't think it'll ever be duplicated again.
Years before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the war in the Pacific really began with the Japanese invasion of China in 1937. That Japanese aggression was little noted by the Western world, which was preoccupied with turmoil in Europe that grew into full-scale conflict upon the German invasion of Poland in 1939. While the West watched and tried to avert further German aggression, the Japanese Empire cast its hungry eyes on the European colonies in Asia. Those holdings were rich in natural resources. Their capture would contribute to the Japanese war effort and deny their use by eventual Western adversaries.
It was to our strategic advantage to keep them there so that they wouldn't be helping their troops on the islands.
In late 1943, Wingate had an opportunity to share his ideas with Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. The U.S. President responded enthusiastically to Churchill's request for air support for the Chindits. Organized in secret as Project 9, about 500 U.S. airmen were deployed to India. This deployment was essentially a miniature version of a complete air force of fighter planes, light bombers, and cargo aircraft. There were also light observation aircraft, troop gliders, and medical evacuation aircraft, including 4 prototype helicopters requisitioned from testing duty.
We started out being Project Number 9, and that's all we were, a special group going out on a special project.
I was a senior in high school, and when war was declared, of course I was like everybody else, I couldn't wait to enlist.
I was originally commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Corps of Engineers as an ROTC student from Louisiana State University in June 1st, 1942. And near the end of 42, while I was on active duty with the Corps of Engineers, I volunteered for pilot training and became a fighter pilot.
I graduated from Cali. Each one of us were commissioned in the reserve, and in my case, I was sent to the 17th Bomb Group at Port Pendleton, Oregon.
I'll tell you, old was 25. I was, I was 23 at the time, and my good friend Joe was 22. He was probably the youngest pilot in the group.
I was chosen as one of the original 523 members that made up the group originally. And I felt honored to be in that group of people.
We had some strange guys in the place. We had one guy that was completely deaf in his left ear. His right ear was good. We asked him, well, how did you get through classification, you know? He said, easy. You went up, the doctor gave you a number in one ear and you repeat it. He said, do 180. They just did a 360-degree turn. Got another number. They called it up and went in. People were eager to get into the service.
Wingate was dispatched to Burma in 1942. His unconventional habits and unconventional tactics proved well suited to an unconventional theater of operations. Project 9 was soon renamed the First Air Commando Group.
Well, there were several reasons why the First Air Commando Group was formed. One, the Japanese had some 8 to 10 divisions of troops in Burma and in China, and it was to the advantage of, it was to our strategic advantage to keep them there so that they wouldn't be helping their troops on the islands.
We did have Japanese Zero type airplanes that were searching for us because they would like to have found our field and strafed us and wiped us out if possible, but somehow the communication systems were in the line somewhere. We got word if a Japanese squadron was flying in our direction, we were warned. We had a very sophisticated warning system. We had a tall bamboo pole set up with 3 big round balls, similar to basketballs or a little larger. And our instructions were if one ball went up on that pole and everybody kept their eye on that pole in the center of the area there, we were to be alerted for a air raid.
It would come down from usually come down from the British, and they'd say they had a target. And fortunately, we felt free to do anything we needed to do to complete the mission. It wasn't a stereotype mission at all. That was one good thing about it. Like in a regular bomb outfit, you take off and climb up, fly to your target, and come home. But this was much more interesting, low level all the time.
In my experience, I think we saw one Japanese aircraft, and that was about it. We were usually in and out of the area before they could even get an airplane up.
Jindit tactics were even adopted by Merrill's marauders attacking the Japanese from China. However, conventional supply techniques, transportation, and medical evacuation could not keep up with the Jindit long-range penetration missions. Jindit casualties were high, and morale suffered along with combat effectiveness. First Air Commando operated under austere conditions, including Spartan facilities, muddy dirt runways, and bad weather in a far-off corner of the war and almost at the tail end of a long supply chain.
We had a rougher experience with the air base that we were based at than I expected, because when we transferred from Karachi, where we had reassembled our aircraft off of the aircraft carrier and was sent up to Hailakandi along the Burma border on the India side of the Burma border, it was not an airport, it wasn't an air base, it was just a dirt field cleared out of some leveled off rice paddies and jungle trees all around us, and we used the biggest part of the area as a runway for the airplane, and the planes were based, and we parked them back up into the trees to keep them as far out of sight as possible. And we had no facilities. We did have a few bamboo built bashas that we had for quarters, and we had no tower, we had no facilities like an airport, you'd think, just a dirt field, and no tool. We had toolboxes, we put those back in the trees and kept our 30 caliber carbines alongside our toolbox and a 45 caliber pistol, which we had assigned to us. We kept that nearby because we were told we could be ambushed.
My crew chief, it got so you walk out the aircraft and he said if it was ready to fly, why we just crawled in. We never made a flight check like they do today. We just crawled in and took off. If he said it was all right, we trusted him.
Filling it with gasoline was a real chore because we did not have big tank trucks there or anything. Our gasoline was 100 octane gasoline, and our planes used a lot of it. And it came in 55-gallon drums. And the transport aircraft would bring them in to us and roll them out on the ground, and then we had to roll them over to our airplanes, stand them on the end, and put the pump in the hole and start pumping. And it took a lot of gas. A mission would take, on a P-51, between 5 and 6 drums of gasoline to fill it after a long mission. And that's a lot of pumping, and that was hard. But the rest of it was routine maintenance, which we were equipped to do and taught to do, and we did it very, very faithfully and thoroughly, knowing that when those planes went out, the life of that pilot was in balance, and so was the airplane. And it was our chore to keep that plane running there and back, unless, of course, it got hit and damaged and something else took over.
Our living quarters would be a room about maybe 15 by 25 feet, and the building was made of bamboo, split bamboo. The floor was made of a lattice work of split bamboo.
In spite of the challenges, the men of First Air Commando were able to maintain their aircraft, get the Chindits into battle, provide combat air support, supply the Chindits, and bring out the wounded. In the process, they earned the respect of the British troops.
To get to the targets from where we were, we had to fly over what they call the Chin Hills. And they were like 8,000 feet mountains, right? The problem, of course, was coming home a lot of times during the monsoon season. We couldn't climb over the weather. We had to go around it. And of course, several times it got pretty hairy. Yeah.
The weather wasn't too good. It was rainy, and the waves were quite high. They were high enough where they were coming up over the bow of the carrier. It wasn't the ideal time to do it. But, they said go, so we had to go.
One incident I remember that the aircraft couldn't get home through the weather. It had to land at Broadway, which was the invasion strip that we had, and they had to spend the night there and then fly back the next day. Yeah. And we've had a couple of times here, some of our aircraft couldn't make it back and had to go to an alternate field somewhere.
the monsoon weather came in on us in late part of April, and on the 19th of May, our base was nothing but a mud hole, and it was just really bad weather, and the base was too out of condition to be an airport anymore, and we were sent back to Asansol, India, further inland, there again to a British airfield where we could recuperate and regroup.
Sometimes we flew as many as 2 missions a day. It was virtually impossible to fly 3 in daylight hours because it was 250 miles to the Burma Valley from where we were, and by the time you did that round trip and then some time over the target, you were in for 3.5 hours, and when you got back, you had to get gas up and get reprovisioned with ammunition and so forth. And by the time you did all that, 2 missions a day was the max you could hope to do.
As vital was the support it sustained, the hump was a bottleneck that occupied enormous resources to deliver a minimum lifeline of supplies. The Chinese and the allies who supported them were threatened with strangulation. British efforts to retake the Burma Road and push the Japanese back away from the vast resources of India were organized under British Colonel Ord Wingate.
I came very close to being shot down on my first mission. As I mentioned earlier, we flew to Rangoon. We escorted a group of B-24 heavy bombers, Liberators, and there were 2 squadrons. The 5th Fighter Squadron, which was the other fighter squadron of the First Air Commando group, and my squadron, which was the 6th Fighter Squadron. And our job, the 6th Fighter Squadron's job, when we got to Rangoon, was to go down on the deck and beat up the Japanese airfields. And so we went down and strafed the Japanese airfields, and we made one pass and then pulled up through there was a light cloud cover at about 1,500 feet. Pulled up through that and did a 180 and came back through it. Of course, there were 20 airplanes, and one behind the other. And since this was my first combat mission, I was the last man. And when I broke out of the cover, going down onto the Japanese airfield to strafe the second time, I heard a sound behind me that sounded like Chinese fireworks. And I knew that I hadn't pulled the trigger to fire my guns, and I knew that it could only be one thing. There had to be a Japanese airplane behind me. And I looked, and there was a Japanese fighter very close behind me.
First Air Commando also pioneered a number of military aviation firsts. These included the first invasion of enemy territory solely from the air, the first night heavy glider assault, the first use of the helicopter in combat, the first combat helicopter rescue, and the first use of air-to-ground rockets. All of these firsts, and many more, were conceived, planned, and achieved in only a few months of active combat.
Our president, Roosevelt, was very adamant with Churchill that he wanted colonialism ended, that he wanted those countries freed.
And we didn't know it at the time, but our group had been so successful, they wanted to bring them back and form new groups. And that's why I think the Special Operations Group took over.
I can't say that our operation had any political effect pro or con. looking at history, Burma was a dictatorship. China is a communist country, and India is now 3 countries. 65 years have passed, and a lot of things have taken place.
It was different. I don't think it'll ever be duplicated again. There was no paperwork. Everybody had a job to do. We were completely short of help. We did everything ourselves. And it was just an unusual experience.
Tactics pioneered by the men of the First Air Commando Group would go on to be employed in the Korean conflict, the Vietnam War, and throughout the Cold War. Descendant units were active in those actions and all the way through the current military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. Air Force's 1st Special Operations Wing, based at Herbert Field, Florida, continues the legacy of the First Air Commando Group's contributions to unconventional warfare.